I haven't been essentially bit by the recession bug yet. I know it's going to happen, but say it would happen, we would have a repeat of last year, where like the S&P 500 and most of the market was down 15 to 20%. Our investment strategy didn't change. The only thing that changed was our mindset, I would say, is while it is tough seeing your account balance drop by 5 figures, every week, at the same time, when we were still investing every month, and we just viewed it as we're getting more shares for a cheaper price because our current perception on the companies we're invested or the market itself hadn't changed. It was just the psychological aspect of what was driving the market. We had faith that when we needed the money in 10, 20 years, that the market would have more than enough time to recoup. So we weren't worried about selling anything. And actually, I don't think we sold anything during last year while the market went down. We just bought every month. Don't be afraid to, ask questions or listen to someone or get advice from someone whose strategy is completely different from your own, because it may change your perspective.
Welcome, millionaires and future millionaires. You're listening to the Millionaires Unveiled podcast, a show where you'll hear the stories and interviews of everyday millionaires. We'll unveil their decisions, their strategies, and their portfolio allocation. Now to your host, Jace Mattinson.
Welcome back to another episode of the Millionaires Unveiled podcast. This is episode number 297. Stace, how's it going? What's going on in your world?
I think I've had a less exciting week than you. What's going on in your world is the real question.
Well, we did celebrate 9 years this last week, which was great. So happy late anniversary to the public, in the public's eye, which was exciting. But yeah, I spent this last week golfing with my dad and playing basketball at a fantasy camp. So yeah, it's been a pretty phenomenal week, and you held down the fort like a champ. So definitely appreciate that. But yeah, it's been something that's been on my bucket list for quite a while this week, probably since before I knew you, actually, come to think of it. So yeah, I had a great time, and met a lot of cool people, and so crazy stuff this week. I guess a couple things. One is summer travel has kicked off. And this year, even with what seems to be kind of a recession pending, I don't really know how to quantify that right now, but the expectation is such that summer travel specifically, and American spending on summer travel expected to break records. The average household is expected to spend almost $3,000 on their summer vacation. So be interesting to kind of see how that takes place, and where, and do people scale back? Seems like with the recent jobs reports, things are still pretty strong, but we continue to see some rate increases and hints of maybe another. So, yeah, something to pay attention to. And then, of course, Biden signed avoided catastrophic default, I should say, and increased our debt ceiling. So some interesting things on the macro level in the economy going on. And I feel like it's been kind of this wait and see game for quite a while here, but I do see in some places things starting to slow down, and who knows what impact or effect that'll have, in the short term and long term. So I know Stace is probably like snoring over there when I start talking about macroeconomics, but at any rate, it does affect
I'm here
all
for
of us. Yeah, you're here for it. Hey, you took an economics class in college, right?
Sure did. Econ 110. Thank you.
Awesome. So, but you're part of summer travel spend. So we, although I think this is probably one of the first years we just really kind of have one little thing planned. But I guess we did our beach trip, weekend beach trip already, but I feel like we normally have more than one vacation, but this year kind of laying low in that regard. So at any rate.
Jace,
what?
here's an econ question for you.
What?
Why don't you explain to our listeners what the potential impact could be on raising the debt ceiling? I feel like this is something we have heard pretty much every year that I can remember recently, that the debt ceiling continues to be raised. So what is the impact of that? Why do we just keep raising it? Why don't we change things? Tell us from your perspective.
That is a question that is far and above my head. I'm not a politician. I'm not an economist. So take this with a grain of salt. But I will say that typically it seems that the kick the can down the road attitude is kind of been something that we've done as a country for a long time. And it's never been something that we've really addressed seriously, I guess, is the best way to put it. Now, we will see how this, plays out. I mean, we continually just print money, create money. I mean, you look at the evolution of, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but you look at the evolution of currency and where things have come from, where they were in the last, say, 50 years to where they are today. It's just, it's wild. And that's why you have probably quite a few of these people out there that are strong believers in, decentralized type of currency and exchange and Bitcoin and Ethereum and other things like that. But I think that's a great question that you pose. And I think it's very deep. There's probably a lot of opinions on it. I don't think there's one particular answer, but at the end of the day, that is something that is very much up to the leaders of our country and the politicians, elected officials, and how they address these things and what they do, as far as the budget and budget cuts and spending and deficits and all that kind of fun stuff that we won't get that deep in the weeds on. But
I will say this, that the debt limit has been raised 78 times since 1960.
Yep, that's crazy, right? We're talking a couple times on average per year, I guess, right?
So I'm feeling like this is an ongoing problem.
It definitely is, in my opinion. That's why I say I feel like it's just a kick of the can down the road to be addressed at a TBD later date. So TBD on that one, but good question. Wanted to read a review this week that we got. A really good one, actually, from this comes from Haas987. Interesting real-world insights. This podcast is unique and interesting. So many others try to convey the same lessons about saving and investing. This podcast brings you real-world approaches implemented by a diversity of people with different careers, salaries, and approaches. It keeps the listener interested as every episode is different and every guest has been successful implementing their own unique approach toward building wealth. The lightning round of questions at the end is always fun to hear the responses. Great job, podcasters. Thanks for that. Once again, we'd love more ratings and reviews from all of you. Continues to help us grow the show, and it's a nice thank you to those that do come and volunteer to be a part of it. If you'd like to be on the show, send us an email, millionairesunveiled@gmail.com, and we'll get you on the calendar, get you scheduled, and go from there. So today, we have Eric. He's in the military. He speaks several languages. He's a linguistics major. So we get into that discussion with him. It's pretty remarkable, all the languages that he's learned. Some of the hardest languages in the world. He has a net worth of $1.2 million. He has a paid-for house worth about $550,000. Roth accounts upwards of $300,000 in traditional in the neighborhood of $60,000. He's got another $150,000 in a brokerage account with some stocks. Keeps a little bit in cash, and then he's got some money in some jewelry and some precious metals. He has no debt and does not use credit cards. So we get into discussion with him about all those kind of details and what his plans are for the future. Last week we had Kevin, his net worth $3.5 million. He worked in the CPG space and has been a W-2 employee or his whole career. So without any further delay, let's get into the episode with Eric. Eric, do you want to just give us a little about your background and what you're up to now?
Sure. My name is Eric. I'm currently active duty in the Air Force. I've been enlisted for the last 16 years. I work as a language analyst. I'm currently stationed down in Georgia. And as far as like an educational background, I have a bachelor's degree in linguistics, and I'm married and I have 2 kids.
No, that's awesome. So, and what is your net worth today?
My current net worth is right around 1.2 million.
Okay. And how is that broken up?
Well, it's pretty simple in my opinion. I have about 540,000 in equity in my house. I have between Roth TSP 401ks and IRAs, I'm sitting in at roughly 290-ish. In traditional TSP, I have roughly 60,000. I have just over 150 in a brokerage account and individual stocks. I have a little in cash, roughly about 20 or so thousand, and then the rest of it is in various assets like precious metals, jewelry, etc. And that's probably about 150 to 200,000.
Wow. So let's dive in this a little bit. So the home equity, is the house paid for?
Yes, I have 0 debt.
Wow. When did you decide to pay off the house?
Well, this is my second house. I bought my first house when I was 21, and it was the starter house. It was a little 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom house down in Georgia, and I bought that before I met my wife. And we, around our 8-year mark of being married, we decided that we wanted to get something a little bigger, try to convince like the in-laws to spend more time in the South with us since they live like 1,000 miles away. So we decided to have a bigger house built that had plenty of room for all the family to move in. But as my wife and I started our financial journey, our goal was by the time our kids were born to have absolutely 0 debt. That way it would alleviate any future stressors as we started to raise a family. So I think we paid off the first house a few weeks before my son was born in October 2017. And then we bought the new house for cash.
Wow. So paying off that house, I mean, were you putting all of your extra income into paying off that house? Did you sacrifice, eating out and all these other kinds of things that people think of when they pay off their house?
The first house, not really. Like it kind of was like our lifestyle. When my wife and I first got together, we kind of had like the very important conversations about where we wanted to be in the future, when we wanted to retire, what our lifestyle was going to look like. And then we created a plan of what we needed to do to get there, as far as how much we had to put aside each month to pay off debt, in that case, to how much we had to put aside towards investing. So early on, from the very beginning of our marriage, we essentially stopped investing and concentrating all of our extra income to paying off like her student loans, because she had a decent amount of student loans. And once we had those paid off, that was our only debt, because we never had credit cards. Like even to this day, neither one of us have a credit card. And so once the student loans were paid off, all we did was throw the money towards the house, but didn't take too long because our initial mortgage balance on that house was relatively small. It was only about $100,000. So once everything was paid off, we were able to adjust our expenditures to kind of throw all the extra income towards investing. But as far as like limiting ourselves, my wife and I would say we are frugal, but we appreciate like quality, and we appreciate a lot of things that don't really require money per se. Like we're both really avid readers. We both like to spend a lot of time. So a lot of our hobbies don't really require a lot of money. So when you look at like the average person, what their miniature expenditures are, like, I don't know, car notes, different streaming services and stuff like that, they add up. But for my wife and I, we haven't had cable in I don't know how long. And the only really streaming service we have is Netflix. So our expenditures each month are actually relatively low. So throughout the years, our income has increased and our lifestyle really hasn't, because a very fundamental part of our like strategy when we're trying to prepare for retirement was we could live within we created a budget that, worst case scenario, we could survive off one of our incomes. And as our incomes increased, it eventually changed to now our monthly expenses represent a very small percentage of our overall income. Like we roughly say between 70 and 80% of our take-home pay every month now.
Wow, that's awesome. So when you had that initial conversation about what type of lifestyle the two of you wanted, is this what you decided on?
Yes. It didn't really take much convincing. My wife, I think, thought I was crazy a little bit because I grew up in a more, I would say, humble upbringing. My mom raised four of us by herself until I was almost in high school, where she got remarried. So money was always a little tight. So she knew my adversity to debt, and she kind of got on board really quickly. She thought I was, had an ambitious goal to pay off her student loans and the house as quickly as we did, because we ended up paying everything off. I think it was in 24 months, and it was between what was left on her car, her student loans, and the house, it was $250,000. And back then our income wasn't that substantial. So as the months progressed and we started making headway towards our goal, I think that it finally clicked that I was serious, and we were actually going to achieve our goal. And what we put on paper wasn't just a far-fetched dream, that it actually eventually will become a reality.
And in that same initial conversation, I think you mentioned that you talked about when you wanted to retire. Did you guys come up with a date for that, or a goal?
Initially, our goal was to be able to retire, both of us, by the age of 50, not relying upon any income from any type of retirement plan or Social Security, just live on our own individual investments. And we came up with our magic number and what we had to put aside. And now that number isn't so far off, our goals have just changed, and not necessarily just taking care of ourselves, to provide security for the next generations within our family.
So for that next generation, are you talking about, leaving something behind for your kids?
Oh, yes. The initial conversation we had, we covered all the facets as far as hey, when we have kids, when you want to have kids, are we going to pay for their college or their education or their vehicles and whatnot like that? And initially, I was completely against paying for my kids' education, right? And my wife was very supportive of us paying for it if we had the means. And as soon as our kids are born, my wife and I essentially agreed that we will cover that expense, because at that time, when our kids eventually reach college age, we knew that we would have the means to be able to fund whatever educational goals they have. That way they wouldn't have to leave school with any type of financial burden. Beyond educational, providing for them for their education. We have also discussed to make sure that our estate is secure enough, that way if something were to happen to us, they were taken care of, and potentially even for our grandkids.
Oh, wow. So even a couple generations out. Wow. Mm-hmm. That's incredibly thoughtful. And I'm really impressed with the conversations that you and your wife had so early in your relationship, it sounds like.
Communication is important, and it's very important to my wife and I. So we just want to make sure that we were on the same page before we, got too serious within our relationship.
Eric, was this something that you had learned from somebody else, or did you just come up with, hey, when I'm dating, when I get married, I want to have these serious conversations, surrounding these things because these are important to me?
No, I think I was raised, in a pretty average home environment where money really wasn't talked about, because I saw the struggles that my mom went through, where the hours that she had to work to provide for me and my brothers and sisters. So beyond just making sure that there's enough to put food on the table and pay the bills, so you had somewhere to live, there wasn't really any financial education that was levied upon me, especially not in school. I would say majority of my financial education has come from personal reading and developing my own mindset and my own goals and strategy as far as what I need to do to get where I want to be.
Where did that desire come from?
I would say early on, like when I was real little, I saw the amount of stress that finances and a paycheck had on my mom when she was raising us. And I guess that kind of like motivated me to become educated so that if I was ever had opportunity to provide for myself and my family, that I could, and an opportunity to eliminate that element of stress, I would do whatever I could. So I would say that was essentially my motivation, because I did that research, my wife and I had those conversations and we put into action the necessary steps to achieve our goal of financial independence. Money has never been a stressor within our relationship, and hopefully it's never a stressor for my kids.
One question one topic I want to go back to just real quick is that first house that you bought. How much was that original mortgage? So
I bought my first house. Let's see, I can't remember if I was 20 or 21. It was $124,900 was what I took out for the loan for that, and that's the only loan that I can remember I've ever taken out in my life.
So you got a pretty substantial chunk in equity increase on that house that you rolled into the next one, or did you save up quite a bit of cash, or a combination of both?
I would say a combination. My equity in that house, I paid it off, but I actually sold it before the market went crazy. So when I sold it, I sold that one my wife and I sold it for $195,900. And sorry, as we proceed, when I say I mean my wife and I, so it's like the I, but in a single form of the we. It's because she's been involved in every single step of all of these financial decisions. And so we had essentially half of what our new house cost, because when I bought my new house, or when we built the new house, I think it came out to about just over 400. It was like 406, 407 what that cost. But when we paid off the last house in November 2017, all that extra income that we had each month, we started throwing towards our retirement and our after-tax brokerage account. And we kind of used that as a buffer. And it just so happened while we were searching, because we couldn't find a house that, we liked, or we couldn't win a bid on a house because we kept on getting our offers rejected. At that time in the stock market, a couple of our individual investments actually really hit off, and it threw us over the threshold. So we had the option to pay for the new house in cash, even if the other house didn't sell.
Wow. So, I mean, as you're going through that decision-making process, was it the aversion to debt that really led you to, hey, I want to make sure that we buy this next one in cash, or talk us through that mindset a little bit?
Oh, once we paid off the last house and the student loans and we were 100% debt-free, my wife and I, we never had any intention to going back in debt. And so we were definitely, when we were looking for houses, we were looking for a house that suited our future needs, but was also within our available cash budget. So that number fluctuated as far as what we were able to afford, essentially like week by week based upon some of our investments. So we still end up buying in the price range of what we were originally looking at, but we end up having a little extra cushion as far as our available funds.
And then what was the price point that you purchased that next one at?
I bought my current house at, I think after all the fees and all that, it came out at 406 or 407.
Okay, so you've got another 100,000 in equity gains in that since you bought it?
I bought it right before the market got crazy, and since then the neighborhood I live in is still building homes, and they just built my exact twin in my house minus some of the upgrades, and they're selling it in my neighborhood for 520, but the plot size is like half of my house. I live in one of the larger plots, so my house right now is, like I said, it's probably around 540 to 550 is what the house is worth right now.
Wow, good for you. And the money that you had invested in the market, is that mainly in equities, or you have some bonds, or what's the breakup there?
So I have zero, my wife and I, we have zero bonds. So as far as in the open market, it's mostly in mutual funds when it comes to the retirement accounts, the Roth IRAs, the TSPs, both the traditional and the Roth and the 401k. And then we have after-tax brokerage accounts that just mimic the stock market essentially. And then we have roughly half of our brokerage account for after-tax funds in individual stocks right now.
Okay. Do you plan to keep that going forward?
Yes, I think that as we progress forward, the only change in our investment plan would be the percentage that's in our after-tax brokerage account, because as with the start of each year, the first thing that my wife and I do is we max out all retirement accounts. So it's as of next week, I think it is, my wife's 401k will be maxed out for the year. I max out the Roth IRAs, the first day of the year that we can. And then my TSP, I'm limited to a certain percentage of my paycheck each month. So that doesn't get maxed out to June. And then once we max out all the retirement accounts, then all of our extra money just goes into our after-tax brokerage account divided between the mutual funds and our individual stocks.
And how many individual stocks do you have?
We keep that actually pretty limited. Right now, we only actually have one because a couple of our stop losses got hit, but we usually keep it to between 3 and 6. We usually don't sell that often, but whenever we buy, we usually establish a stop loss and we update as the price moves. But at the beginning of each year, at the end of each year, around like November, December, we come up with a list of like 6 stocks that we're both interested in if we're looking to invest in something new that we currently aren't investing in. And then we individually rank our top 3. And if we agree on a stock, that's usually what we go to. And if we disagree on any investments, we go with whatever is more conservative.
Interesting. Just for our listeners, will you elaborate on what it means when you refer to stop loss on those stocks?
So whenever we enter in any investment, we discuss what we hope to see that stock do in the near future, 24 to 36 months, and what we hope that stock price is going to be at. But at the same time, we understand that there's risk in everything we do. So whenever we enter any investment, we also establish an exit price. And usually it's pretty conservative, I would say, but we usually establish the initial stop loss around 10% of whatever the initial price in which we enter individual stock. And then if that individual stock share price tends to go up, we'll update it, and we usually keep it pretty tight to the current price. That way, if something unexpected happens and I don't have my stocks open, we could exit our position and minimize our loss.
Interesting. So the way you think about your investments now, I know you said you'd max out from the beginning of the year, but you're also generating a significant amount of savings relative to your income. How do you think about allocation of your next dollars, between all these different things other than, you got your house paid for, you got your retirement accounts maxed out. Where do things go after that? And now that you've got this big flywheel going on, where you've got this big base built up, what's next?
And that's always the question, what's next? And until my wife and I come up with like a solid plan forward, we like to continue on the current path. And like you said, we like to have our bases covered and make sure our future, retirement plans are fully funded first. That's why we do our retirement accounts first. And then we start to invest all the extra funds into the brokerage account. But my wife and I have had plenty of discussions. And what is this money in that brokerage account that's for the after-tax dollars going to be used for? Why are we putting the amount that we are into it? And we haven't come to a final decision yet. We've discussed the entrepreneurial route once I exit the military in 4 years to small business ownership. But one thing that my wife and I agree on at this point is we don't think we're going to get into real estate. I have plenty of friends who make a decent living buying houses, becoming landlords and whatnot. But my wife and I, we have zero interest in going that route. We feel secure in our current strategy where we invest mostly in our mutual funds, and then we have no more than 25% of our portfolio allocated to an after-tax brokerage account. Well, that's what the current rate is, but we don't really know at this point what's next as far as how we're going to branch out and deviate from our current investment strategy, because right now our investment strategy is kind of like on autopilot. We essentially make 2 transfers a month with our money. At the end of each month, we either transfer money to our savings if we happen to have a large expenditure during a month that we buy and to replenish our emergency fund in cash, or we transfer money into our brokerage account for every extra dollar. So at the end of each month, all of our accounts reset. So essentially it takes all the thinking out of it. And unless one of our stop losses gets hit or one of our individual stocks there, it hits our target share price and nothing significant changed, and we have to discuss if we're going to exit that position or not.
Eric, how did you come to the conclusion that you were not interested in real estate as a investment vehicle?
So I love to read. I read 2 to 3 books a week when I'm not in class. And I like to explore I like to explore different people's financial strategies and what's worked from them. And it seems like almost every book I read, everybody seems to have a decent percentage of their portfolio in real estate. But I forgot what book I read. It's like Invest in What You Know. And while I understand my own primary residency and what it requires out of me each month, each year for that, I don't understand the real estate market enough to fully take advantage of it in the manner which will bring me the most profit. Whereas I'm not saying I understand the stock market and individual stocks and playing that game, because I don't day trade, I don't sell options, I don't sell puts and all that. I just buy shares and I hold them. I understand that aspect enough where I feel comfortable, and my wife feels comfortable with our money staying in there short-term or long-term. We don't feel comfortable buying investment properties at this point. I guess that may be due to a lack of knowledge in that sector. And we do read a lot to try to increase our knowledge base in that area. But right now we don't feel comfortable.
But you are comfortable picking your primary residences to
yes.
own?
Oh, we have no issue with that. And I think if we were to venture into the buying a couple investment properties, we would do okay. But at the same time, I think at this point in our life, with my wife's career and my career and having 2 young kids at home, I think it might be more of a headache as opposed to continuing along our current investment strategy and maintain our current portfolio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely a lot more work from what I've heard. So you mentioned the buy and hold strategy. I'm curious how you think about that when you also think about the stop loss strategy. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of, March 2020 when everything tanked. What did you do in that scenario?
So surprisingly enough, at that time, most of our money was just in mutual funds. I wasn't in individual stocks, and we actually were kind of liquid. As far as a couple of other investments finally came to fruition, we exited them. So we actually were sitting pretty cash heavy at that point. And when we re-entered the market towards the end of the year and the next summer, we were fortunate enough to enter into some of our holdings that actually very well profits and to enough to where they paid for our house. So I haven't been essentially bit by the recession bug yet. I know it's going to happen, but say it would happen, we would have a repeat of last year, where like the S&P 500 and most of the market was down 15 to 20%. Our investment strategy didn't change. The only thing that changed was our mindset, I would say, is while it is tough seeing your account balance drop by 5 figures, every week, at the same time, when we were still investing every month, and we just viewed it as we're getting more shares for a cheaper price because our current perception on the companies we're invested or the market itself hadn't changed. It was just the psychological aspect of what was driving the market. We had faith that when we needed the money in 10, 20 years, that the market would have more than enough time to recoup. So we weren't worried about selling anything. And actually, I don't think we sold anything during last year while the market went down. We just bought every month.
Yeah, while you're in the wealth accumulation phase, it's pretty nice that you can buy it. Mm-hmm. I believe earlier you mentioned that you don't use credit cards. Did I hear that right?
Yes, I get a lot of The topic of credit cards, I get a lot of flack from my coworkers. Neither my wife and I have a credit card, and we have actually 0 open lines of credit. So if we were to actually go for a loan, we would have to do probably a manually underwritten loan. But our philosophy and our financial strategy has always been, if we can't pay for it in cash, we're not going to buy it. So that kind of like changes how we go about purchasing bigger items. And it makes us actually think, do we really need it or do we want it? Especially when it comes to vehicles and stuff like that.
So do you think you'll continue that path of, never having a credit card or even short-term debt?
Unless something dramatically changes, I don't foresee my wife and I ever having a credit card or opening any type of loan ever again.
Okay.
Like I know when I said like in the beginning, like when we first started off and got married, we were very risk adverse, right? But once we established our basis and we made sure we had our basic needs covered, right? We had a decent enough income where all of our, housing, food needs were covered. And once we paid off the house, we decided to accept certain amounts of risk. And that's can be seen in our investment strategy, like when it comes to investing in individual stocks and some of the investments we make for our after-tax brokerage account. But we're okay with risk now because worst case scenario, if we were to make a bad decision and lose that part of an investment, our lives wouldn't change in the slightest. The only thing that would change is a number on a piece of paper would go down for a short period of time.
So Eric, I want to dive a little bit into your career a little bit, because I think it's been a major engine in your success, but it's also extremely unique. So if you don't mind just expanding a little bit on what you do and maybe even how many languages you speak and why you chose to go the military route after high school.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Like I said, I'm a language analyst in the Air Force, which throughout my 16-year Air Force career, I've been fortunate enough to be given the opportunity to acquire multiple languages. So for the first decade of my career, I focused in the Middle East, and I started with Arabic, acquired some dialects. Then I switched to some European languages, Romance languages, and then the most recent part of my career, I finally switched over to Asia and picked up Mandarin Chinese. So throughout that career field, it's kind of limited. There's not many as opposed to like other career fields as far as the community size. But working in this type of environment where you're essentially are a student your whole career, because regardless if you finish your initial training in a new language set, you're always acquiring upgrade training and refresher school. And like you have this mindset like ingrained in you that if you ever stop learning, you're going to fall behind. And I think that's really like affected the manner in which I address everything else in my life, especially when it comes to finances. Like I am well aware that no matter how much I read and how much I soak in and absorb when it comes to personal finances or financial planning, that I'm never going to know enough or know everything that's out there. So my career is kind of like directing me down this path that I'm used to always being a student, and I'm very receptive to acquiring new information.
Wow, and it's pretty remarkable to learn. Having learned a second language myself, I know how hard that is, and the languages you've learned are extremely difficult. So, at any rate, thank you for your service in the military, and props to you for learning those languages and doing what you do. So at this point, you've got everything paid off, not going into debt, real estate's probably off the table, you're going to continue to invest in the market, plans at some point to potentially move on from the military and retire from that, so to speak. I mean, where else do you go from here? Do you have a target net worth you're trying to, get to, or passive income, or where do things head for you?
So as we look towards the future, my wife and I, we've actually had this conversation a couple months ago, is updating our goals. Because when we initially had our conversation 10 years ago before we got married about where we wanted to be when we retired, that magical number was $2.3 million. And when we crossed into the 2 Comma Club almost 2 years ago, that distant number of 2.3 million no longer seemed like it was too distant or so far away, and it was actually attainable in a lot shorter time frame than before we turned 50. So of course we upgraded and we adjusted our financial goals, and now what we're going to work towards is we would like to hit the $10 million mark before we're age 45 and proceed from there. But as far as our next goals, we've discussed, how we're going to take our current capital, our current investment portfolio after I retire to use to bring more enjoyment or maybe alter our career choices. So, and the options are pretty wide ranging. For example, my wife, she's a pilot, but she works for a small aviation company, and she has a very good job and she really enjoys flying. So now, since we have a relatively good income and with relatively low expenses, all this money in our brokerage accounts, we've even discussed putting it aside, letting it accumulate so we can actually buy a plane that either for personal or private use, and maybe turning that into some type of business in the future, or after I get out of the military in 4 years to essentially just change altogether. If my wife wanted to take on a different line of employment with a different company or in a different part of the world, that is an option to us, because I feel like the last 12 or so years that we've been together, our location of where we have lived has been dependent upon my career. And once I'm retired, I'm more than willing, and I'll be happy to support my wife in any way she can, as far as if she wants to change her employment, stop working at all, or go into the aviation business herself. So I think right now we are just going to build up our after-tax brokerage account and our available cash funds to fund whatever that next step is. But we want to make sure that that bag that we're going to be drawing from, is large enough to support any of our future goals.
It seems like there could be a business where your wife does the flying and you do the translating, and you go all around the world.
So it sounds weird, but I don't think I'm going to use languages when I get out of the military. I know I've been told it's a waste by coworkers and family, but I enjoy learning languages for my own personal use, and I loved my job. I love my job, but when the time comes for me to leave my military service behind, I think I'm also going to leave that part of my job behind too. Whereas if I use languages, it's going to be for my own personal use and for travel, which is kind of ironic because I geared my career to make sure I had like the business languages covered. Because when you look at like the 3 most useful business languages in the world, it's Mandarin Chinese, MSA Arabic, and English. And my wife, I think she thinks I'll change my mind and go into the translation business. But at this point in my life, I don't know if that's going to be the route I follow.
Okay, so I'm so curious. How long does it take you to learn a language?
It depends. Every language in the eyes of the military requires a different amount of time to obtain basic proficiency, right? Where essentially you could be dropped off in that country and you could survive, right? You're not going to, survive to the point of like a native college graduate, but you could survive, do whatever you need to do in that language. So, for example, Romance languages, Spanish, French, German, the military, they usually give you about 6 months to learn the language. I know it sounds like a short period of time, but that's your job, that's your life, 7 days a week, 8 to 10 hours a day. For the Cat 4 languages or Cat 5 languages like Arabic and Chinese, you're given a year and a half. But that's just to obtain basic proficiency. Once you finish your formalized training, it's never ending. So in the linguistic field, they say you have an active vocabulary and a passive vocabulary. An active vocabulary means that you could readily produce a translation from whatever your native tongue into the target language which you're trying to translate into. Whereas a passive language is you may not be able to actively produce it, like translate a sentence verbatim, But if someone were to say the sentence, or if you read that sentence, you'll be able to understand it and translate it. So they say if you don't use your languages on a daily basis, you lose roughly 6 to 8 words of your active vocabulary daily. So in cases like me, where I have a few languages, the only way around it that I have done to like maintain my languages is all I do is read news in other languages on my free time. I don't usually read the news in English that much because I don't really have anyone to practice my languages with.
So cool. So impressive. So thinking about your potential plane, which sounds awesome, would you buy that in cash?
Oh, of course. Like we've been discussing buying a plane for the last few years for personal consumption, for personal use, and buy a little 6-seater so we could fly and see family. And obviously the ones we're looking at were used, and they go in the range between like 200 and 400,000, but it's not necessarily a need at this point. It's definitely a want, but we have arranged our finances that way. If the need were to arise, and that was something that we decided we needed, or we would buy it in cash. I don't think I would, even if we were to go and buy or try to get into the aviation business itself, it would be something that I would start from the ground. My wife and I would start from the ground up. I don't think we would go into debt for it.
So I wonder when it will become a need.
Sometimes it feels like that since our family lives 1,000 miles away. So we definitely drive a lot to see our family. If you ask me, my wife might have a different answer, but I think that we will probably have a plane of our own in the next 5 years.
Well, we heard it here first. Can't wait to catch a ride.
The wife will be flying. She's the pilot.
Awesome, Eric. Well, let's wrap up with some rapid fire questions. What's the most expensive pair of pants you've purchased?
I would say $30, but my wife usually does all the shopping for clothes for me.
What about the most expensive car that you've purchased?
My wife's truck. My wife drives big trucks, and so I bought her a new Turbo Boss Silverado. So that was, I don't know, sticker was on it, was over 60. So somewhere in the mid 60s, I would think.
Okay. What about the most expensive meal out that you paid for?
For just my wife and I, for like the tab, because usually when we go out, I don't let like family pay. So my wife and I, if we bought dinner for like our whole family, and I have a big family, so I would think that's probably $600 to $800.
Okay. Wow. Nice. Nice to go out to dinner with Eric. What's been the range of household income?
When my wife and I got married, I think we were making right around 100,000 a year, and now we bring home roughly 18 to 19,000 a month after taxes.
Okay. And I guess if you're living on 80/20, so you're spending $2,000 to $3,000 a month for living expenses? Right
now we roughly about 3,000 to 4,000 right now, and majority of that's daycare.
Okay. So $40 to $50 a year. How much of that is daycare? You said a majority of it?
Well, that's our largest expense. Like
Gotcha.
Right now we pay roughly, I think, $1,500 a month in daycare. And so that's our largest singular expense is daycare.
Okay.
And then so I would say food and utilities are only a few $100 and gas. But I'm also, in that $4,000 average, I'm also including my property taxes for the year and our car insurance that we pay every 6 months.
Okay.
It just averages about $4,000.
Real quick, I just had a thought too. You probably have a pension as well, right? From the military?
Yes. When I retire from the military, I'll get if I get out my 20-year mark, I'll get 50% of my base pay, which is in today's dollars, roughly about $2,200 a month. So it's not spectacular, but it's
forever though, right?
Yes, it'll be forever.
I mean, they put a value on that. It's a few $1,000,000 added to your net worth probably, right?
Well, but when we came up with our retirement plan, we tried to come up with a number that didn't include any pensions, because who knows, I could have changed my mind earlier in my career and decided to get out, or something could change in the future.
That's fair. What do you think is the key to success?
Patience. And like everybody thinks that if you create a plan and it's going to come to fruition in no time at all, they fail to take into account the amount of hard work and time that it takes to actually, come to fruition, to achieve your goals. And so if a person has patience and perseverance to actually see that plan through, I think they'll be successful regardless of what their goals are or regardless of what their incomes are. Because once you establish a plan and you get into that mindset of where you want to be, therefore you adjust your actions so you could actually eventually get there. It's just a matter of time. So I would say patience.
Okay. What has been the most fun that you have had with money?
Most fun I've had with money. Most of my hobbies are free. All right. This is probably not the answer that I would go with if I would have had more time to think about, but my son, last year he was 4 years old and he loves playing putt-putt, and he comes home one day from daycare and he's like, Dad, can you build me a putt-putt course? And I'm like, I could do that. So it wasn't a lot of money. So over the course of all of last year, I put money into our yard when it comes to like leveling, dumping yards upon yards of sand and soil, and buying a specific type of lawnmower and the materials needed so I could get my yard level and smooth so I could build them a putt-putt course. So at the end of the last year, before the grass went dormant for about 2 months, we had a 9-hole putt-putt course in our backyard for the neighborhood kids. And now it's something I think we're going to be doing year after year. I'm actually just getting the yard ready to build them a new course. I'm just waiting for my son to draw up this year's design. So in the big scheme of things, it didn't cost much. I think it was only $2,000 to $3,000 between all the material because I did all the labor myself. But for the amount of fun and satisfaction that it brought to my family and the neighborhood kids, I would probably say the putt-putt course.
Okay. What's been the biggest mistake that you've made with money?
Oh, let's see. That's biggest mistake I've made with money. One of the most financially irresponsible things, I think, if you look at my strategy, is buying new cars. I know there really isn't a need to buy, a $60,000 truck or a $30,000 car, but I do that. But I would say, I got back from overseas about a decade ago. I had to go overseas for work, and the first thing I bought was, I think it was like $4,000 watch, and I think I only wear that watch like 1 or 2 times a year. So looking back at it, I thought it was a cool expense and I needed that watch, but now I look at it as just a waste of money.
And you still have it?
Yeah. It's probably going to go to my son, but yeah, I still have the watch, still works, but.
And how much was it?
I think at that time it was like $4,000.
Okay. And become a family heirloom now?
That'd be up to my son.
Good deal. What's one last piece of advice that you would give somebody who's just beginning their journey?
One last piece of advice. Never stop reading, because no matter what your personal opinion is on a topic, you could always be influenced by others. And don't be afraid to, ask questions or listen to someone or get advice from someone whose strategy is completely different from your own, because it may change your perspective.
Awesome. That's Eric with a net worth of $1.2 million. Probably a little bit more than that if we include the pension. Thanks for coming on the show today.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Millionaires Unveiled podcast with Jace Mattinson. For more stories, investment opportunities, and information, check out our website, millionairesunveiled.com. See you next time when you'll hear from another everyday millionaire.